Hello, boxing fans around the world, and thank you once again for joining us for another exciting episode on Boxing 247. Christian, how you doing?
Pretty good. You?
I'm doing quite well, thank you. Let me start today's episode off with a little caveat. We are talking about the 80s versus the current heavyweights and who would win. Well, just for the benefit of you and the viewers, the 80s for me were, in fact, the 80s. I was in my roaring 20s, quite frankly, having graduated from university, ending up in Bermuda, a rock in the middle of the ocean, where my house did not have a television. And then coming back to Canada, enjoyed a career in the music industry and didn't have any time for television. So my knowledge base here with respect to 80s fighters, with the exception of a couple of names, is rather limited. So how about this as a bit of a different angle, if you will? According to the Grueling Truth, there are top 10 heavyweights from the 1980s that they list. And if you don't mind, I will just read the introductory paragraph, which I think is a funny encapsulation, quite frankly. And then we might move forward, if you will, and discuss each of these fighters, but I must rely on your memory because mine is rather foggy from the 80s. Let me begin by introducing the 80s for you. Okay, I know what you're thinking. Why would you pick the heavyweights of the 1980s to rank? This is the era I grew up with. Sure, they were not always the most action-packed fights, but you did have two all-time greats dominate the division. And you had a multitude of fighters who had unreal talent. Guys like Tony Tubbs, Jerry Cooney, and Greg Page, who, for whatever reason, fell well short of being all-time greats. Almost all these guys' problems were in their head. Not all, but most. So let's take a look at the top heavyweights of the 1980s. And for the benefit of the viewers, compare them to today's fighters and whether they had any chance whatsoever. Number 10 on their list was Greg Page. Christian, are you familiar with Greg Page?
R.I.P. Absolutely. Greg Page, sad story. Absolutely. R.I.P.
So, do you want to suggest whether or not he would have? I'll tell you.
Okay. We're gonna go through and do.
Well, I'll tell you
as we go down.
I'll tell you. I can either tell you who the 10 are all in a row, or we can comment on each one as we go through them.
Okay. Memories of Greg Page, apart from his untimely death, where his last pro bout was against a fighter called Dale Crow. He was KO'd. There was a bleed on the brain. Landed up for many years homebound, being looked after by his, I think it was his sister, or was it wife? I think it's sister. I know Gerald McLennan's looked after by his sister. But it went on for many years, and he didn't appear to be getting any worse. There were some improvements, and whichever year it was, he died. That's a sad story about him. Now, as a fighter, he did win the heavyweight championship, I do believe, once. But it was in this period of time in the heavyweights where we're going to exclude Mike Tyson, who was champion from November the 22nd, 1986. And we're going to, for the moment, not talk about Larry Holmes, who was dominant through the 80s from 1978, if I'm right with that one, against Ken Norton. Very good fight. If you've never seen it, I was just about to say the result, but Ken Norton, Larry Holmes, one of the all-time great fights. Anyway, those two aside, when you mentioned Tony Tubbs, you had Pinkley Thomas, you had Greg Page, you had all these fighters, and it's what they deemed the lost years, where it was regarded as lots of unmotivated heavyweights that were overweight, with the heavyweight crown being passed from one to the other, which in essence was true, but that was looking more from the 90s perspective, from their point, where the 90s was very good. As we now move on to the noughties, as they call it, or into up to 2020 and now in 2021, that top 10, which you're about to read, including Greg Page, actually isn't that bad. His weight was an issue, as is going to be the case with many of the fighters we're going to discuss today of the heavyweights in the 80s. He held it once, I do believe. He lost it. Was it the first defense? A little bit forgettable. One of the culprits for handing it round, unmotivated, overweight, had potential. went on for too long, and certainly didn't reach their potential. I'm sure most of these fighters, I'm going to say, same applies to this one. It's pretty much a case with a good, probably 60-70% of the fighters I'm sure you're about to mention, Greg Page being one of them. But sad story at the end of his career. He went on fighting too long. He went on as a sparring partner for too long. He famously, I use that word, knocked Mike Tyson down in sparring prior to his Mike Tyson's first loss with James Buster Douglas. He was a sparring partner for many years as well, but it's just the amount of blows to the head, and the one final fight with Del Crow was just finished the brain off. There's a bleed on the brain, and the rest is a very sad history.
Just to spark your memory, according to his bio, he had win, and these are not men who will be mentioned in our top 10 list today, but he had wins over Alfredo Evangelista, Jimmy Young, and Quick Tillis. So those are some names from the 80s who we might not make our top 10 list, but certainly are mentioned in terms of fighting in that era. Number 9 on the list, Trevor Berbick.
R.I.P. Killed by his nephew over an argument to do with land. Now, Berbick, as I'm going to choose my words right here, was apparently a not so nice person. There was huge rifts with many heavyweights, especially a huge rift with Larry Holmes all the way through the 80s, because he did challenge for the heavyweight title with Holmes. He lost against Holmes on a unanimous decision over 15 rounds. But from then on, because it was a spirited effort, he chased Holmes and chased and tried every single tactic, and it all led up to a confrontation in 1991 where Larry Holmes, at the end of the press conference for his first fight after returning against Tim Doc Anderson, Larry Holmes running across the tops of the cars and doing a drop kick on Trevor Berbick while police were at hand. If you've never seen it, Graham, I've got it, and I can send you a link.
Wow.
Not staged, not anything. It is shocking. It is kind of wrestling, kind of action style, but actually real, not scripted, and certainly not a drama. Well, it was actually a drama, but it was definitely real. Now, he was heavyweight champion. Did he make a defense? I don't think so, but he lost it on November the 22nd, 1986, against the one and only Mike Tyson. He went into that bout, I think it was with 2 defeats. He was a capable heavyweight. He was never out of a bad shape. He gave Holmes a very good tussle for the heavyweight title. Was it prior to that, or was this after? And he was famously, got to use that word again, known as the last person to beat Muhammad Ali in the Bahamas in 1981, I do believe. November 1981, I think it was.
He has the distinction of being the only man to be in the ring with both Muhammad Ali, Larry Holmes, and Mike Tyson.
Yep. That is the one.
A good adjective.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Yep.
A good adjective they use for Berbick is rugged, a rugged fighter.
Right, yeah, rugged brawler. He can't say a rugged brawler against Tyson because he lost in the second round by KO, famously flopping all over the place. Remember the punch on the forehead,
yes.
And it was a multiple knockdown from the one punch. Great KO with Tyson. It sparked off his reign of terror on the heavyweight division, certainly at that level. After that loss, he was pretty much in and out of the scene. He never challenged for a heavyweight title again. He lost in a couple of heavyweight title eliminations. And sort of kept around the kind of fringe level up until a very long decline. But saying that, he did have some resurrection where he did win the Canadian heavyweight title, I do believe, towards the end of his career, but it just slowly just fizzled away. But from what I remember, there was no sharp decline in his career, at least. But yes, he holds a couple of distinctions there, and one very memorable KO, or certainly being at the end of it, courtesy of Mr. Iron Mike Tyson.
Right. And coming in at number 8, probably due to his late entry in the late 80s, but coming in at number 8 is Evander Holyfield. Your favorite fighter.
Yeah, apart from he wasn't a heavyweight in the 80s.
He was a cruiserweight, right?
Yes, he turned pro at light heavyweight, cruiserweight. He then turned pro in 1990, I do believe. If I'm wrong by a couple of months, do apologise. And his heavyweight pro debut was against James Quick Tillis, beating Tillis by TKO in the 5th round. So with that, he wasn't an 80s heavyweight. He was 90s all the way into 2000s, which really shouldn't have happened. But no, surprised they've included that, because no, he didn't turn into the heavyweight division. I think it was 1990. But James Quick Tillis was the first heavyweight fighter he fought, and that was a 5th round TKO.
When was this fight against Dokes, Michael Dokes?
Michael Dokes was in 1991, I think it was. That was because Holyfield, he fought, let me think, James Quick Tillis, he fought Pinklon Thomas, which was Thomas's first fight after losing to Mike Tyson. You had Alex Stewart, when Alex Stewart was unbeaten. You had the Michael Dokes fight, which, if you've seen that fight, RIP Michael Dokes, brilliant fight. That was a 10th round stoppage for Holyfield. But that was with Michael Dokes, one of the forgotten, lost years heavyweight champions. I don't know if we're going to mention him in a moment, but you know, drugs got the better of Michael Dokes after much promise, because he was a very skilled fighter. Are we coming on to Michael Dokes in a moment? Because he should be in the top 10.
Michael
Otherwise,
Dokes.
I won't go into too much detail.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. Because
okay, well, he won the title.
Replace Evander with Michael Dokes.
Absolutely, that is a good replacement. He put up a very spirited performance, but it was in the 90s. It was the 1991, I do believe, because it was about 3 fights before he challenged James Buster Douglas after he beat Holyfield.
Right.
Now, he was very good. And the thing is that drugs killed the version 1 of his career. He then had a lot of time off doing drugs, came back with manager Marty Cohen, the old manager that, bless him, he used to, as a promoter, he used to parade the perimeter of the ring, actually in the ring, with red roses, and famously, for the 3rd time, throwing them out to the ladies in the audience while this chap was in his 80s with a big Stetson on his head.
Wow.
Dokes, he was brought back by Mr. Cohen, and he did well. There was a few, you know, the usual journeyman and blowovers, but the first test for Dokes version 2 was against Holyfield. Now, as much as he lost, he gained a lot of respect in the fight with Holyfield, because as much as he lost by TKO in the 10th round, I do believe, you know, it was back and forth all the way through the fight. Again, if you've not seen that, it's one of the ones top 10 heavyweight fights definitely to watch. After losing to Holyfield, obviously, I know we're venturing briefly into the 90s here, because I said it's about 1991. He had a couple of fights. He lost to Razor Ruddock, courtesy of one of Ruddock's, what do they call it? The smash, that hybrid uppercut, stroke, whatever you want to call it, hard punch. Lost to Dokes, and then finally, somehow in 1993, challenged good old Riddick Bowe for the heavyweight title, being blown out in, shockingly, not the 1st round. And it really stopped there. But Dokes died, I do believe, at age 52. He landed up being clean. He got arrested, went back inside prison for a couple of years, came out, was completely straight. And yes, died. I mean, he died early. I think it was 51 or 52. There were so many heavyweights from around that period that died around that time, like Cole, the Truth Williams. Right. There's a long list of them that died around 52, 51. It was really shocking. It's like the 27 Club with singers from the 60s and 70s. Now, you know, it was wasted talent, because he, you know, was quick. He had power. I mean, is it a 17-year-old? I do believe it was. He was 17 or 18 when he had that famous exhibition with Muhammad Ali, the one in the intro to this video where Ali is leant against the ropes and he's avoiding the punches. Dokes was only, 18, I think it was. Still an amateur at the time, hadn't turned over. And as much as, yes, at that particular point with Ali in the corner, not laying a punch on him, the rest of it, you know, he showed good promise. And as a heavyweight, he was quick, he was powerful. He just wasted it all, because as soon as he won the championship, that was it. Straight headfirst into drugs and dicking about, I'm sure, like somebody else we discussed yesterday, and lost the title in his first defense. I think, if I remember right, he won the title from, let me remember, it was a KO, I think, against Mike Weaver, something like in the 13th round. And then did he defend it once, but it went on points and then lost it. I know he lost it to Jerry Cooney from South Africa. But no, shame. There was so much more from him. There were so many years lost because he came back version 2 overweight. He had this stomach that as much as he was training hard, he just couldn't shift. The abuse was there, hence why he died in his early 50s. But no shame. That was big wasted talent because he could have been dominant, I think, if it was taken seriously upon winning the championship.
The 80s have lessons for all of us, for sure, even to this day.
Yes. Mr. Morrison didn't learn about his dicking about with, because Michael Dokes was one for drugs and women. And of course, Tommy Morrison was all about drugs and women.
Right.
But a huge amount. I mean, that's 2 huge playboys that should be still with us now, but sadly not.
These are some of the intangibles. Anyway, number 7 on our list of great heavyweights from the 80s, Michael Spinks.
Oh, one of my favorite fighters. Now, Spinks had 4 fights at heavyweight. He was dominant light heavyweight. He was actually the middleweight gold Olympics in the 1978 Olympics. 76, sorry, yes. It was 76. Middleweight, and his brother Leon won light heavyweight. Now, he turned pro, won the light heavyweight title, and unified it, which was unheard of back then. The last fight against Dwight Muhammad Cowie, or was known at the time as Dwight Braxton. Now, then Spinks ventured into the heavyweight division and went straight in, I do believe, I think it was 1985, could have been 86, 85. Went straight in with Larry Holmes. Now, Holmes was, even at 35 or 36, was overwhelming favourite, even if his skills were fading. But he absolutely shocked Holmes and won a 15-round unanimous decision, snapping the record of Holmes, which stood at that time as 47, I know if I'm right, because he would have equaled Marciano's record of 48-0 if he was successful in this fight, which he was not. Now, Holmes did force the rematch. There was no rematch clause. Spinks obliged. This fight, Holmes did actually train sensibly. He took the challenger Spinks seriously, and it was a much harder fight. He even had Spinks down in the second to last round, I do believe. Now, that fight was a split decision with Spinks winning, which was, I think that's the one where Holmes said in the post-fight interview, which ruffled a lot of people, which is why a lot of people, or some people, remember Larry Holmes as no, because he said the famous fourth time comment, which was he wouldn't carry this was in respect to Rocky Marciano, he wouldn't be able to carry my jockstrap. And at that point, a lot of people turned off from Larry Holmes, even if he did retire at that point, come back, lost to Tyson in 88 in 4 rounds, then came back in 91, as discussed the other day, against Tim Doc Anderson, who's in prison now for killing a boxing promoter, Rick Parker.
Wow.
But there were other fights at heavyweight, because that was 1, 2. You had Stephen Tankstead. So there would have been 5 fights at heavyweight. So the 2 fights with Larry Holmes. Then had Stephen Tankstead, which he won, I think it was the 5th round. Stephen Tankstead was European level. He was Norwegian. Even if boxing was actually banned in Norway at the time, he had to train and do everything over in the US. It was a routine knockout. He was purely just a rugged heavyweight European level. Spinks dispatched him. You then had the big fight where Spinks was actually the underdog against Jerry Cooney. Jerry Cooney coming back after the loss to Larry Holmes back in 1983. Now, with the fight, Spinks was all over him up until, I think it was a KO in the 7th round. Great fight. It was very much one of these fights where you had the big guy versus the small guy, and the small guy being quicker, landing many punches, with Cooney trying to land his trademark powerful hooks, which he didn't do much of, hence the defeat. But with that, Spinks was put into the 1988 fight with Mike Tyson, came in even heavier, which took away, it's pretty much like the Wilder Fury thing, where Spinks came in heavier, which took away some of the advantage in speed that he may have had, or a lot of people were saying he had, that gave him, a bit of a chance against Tyson. because Tyson at that point wasn't regarded, still small test. What's he going to do against an unbeaten quick fighter like Spinks, even if it was a light heavyweight? But Spinks, unfortunately, was dispatched in 89 seconds. Why so quick? As much as he's one of my favorite fighters, I thought he was going to go longer, but lose eventually. The problem is that Michael Spinks was a notorious slow starter, and Mike Tyson was a notorious fast starter. Put the two together, and you get 89 seconds. At that point, after a payday of 9 million, Michael Spinks abruptly retired. And for some reason has managed to, like many boxers, mismanage their finances and have not much left at all. He's got his health intact. He's very happy. He goes to all the events in America. He's been inducted in the Hall of Fame, etc., as one of the best light heavyweights ever, which he will be regarded as. But with just the aforementioned 5 fights at the heavyweight, finishing with the bout with Tyson. I always used to think, why did Spinks retire at that point, and why he didn't drop back in weight? And for years, it's a question I wanted to put to him. But having seen more fighters go up in weight than go back in weight, I can see exactly the reason why he didn't. Or it may not have been the reason why he didn't, but if he did, it would have been catastrophic, because fighters cannot go up in weight and go back down in weight successfully, especially towards the end of their career. But it was, I think that's a good place for him as a heavyweight. I possibly would have had him a bit higher, because apart from the Tyson blowout, which Tyson would have done to, I'd say, against anybody in a short peak between 85 and 88, everyone else, Larry Holmes, yes, I was just about to say towards the end of his career, but Holmes went on for ages, up until the age of 52, and his last fight was in 2000. Okay, that was at a slightly lower level, but he still went through at a decent level, going twice for the heavyweight championship, whatever. It was a good win then for Spinks, or 2 wins over Holmes. Tankstead, European, Jerry Cooney only had 1 knockout loss. It was short, but it was a reasonable career. So I would have personally had him slightly heavier, not because he's one of my favorite fighters, because I like him as a light heavyweight. But very good fighter. Shame that it was a combination, as I said before, with, he sort of come head to head with Tyson and come off a very much second best.
I mean, that's one thing that we often overlook, is the very volatile nature of the 80s themselves, because you had different fighters coming into the 80s than exiting out of the 80s. And here's a great example. Number 6, Jerry Coetzee, out of South Africa, number 6.
Yes, Jerry Coetzee. Yeah, Coetzee. There we are. That's the
Coetzee. Yeah, wins over Michael Dokes, Quick Tillis.
Yes, he had supposedly the bionic hand. People in Britain will remember Jerry Coetzee losing. Bear in mind, Coetzee was at the end of his career, but he lost to Frank Bruno in 1 round, knocked through the ropes, flat on his back, and not looking in a very good state at all. But he was a 2-time heavyweight champion, but he was one where it was at the beginning of the 80s where he won a portion of it, losing it and not retaining it in good fashion. But again, he was, it's one of these, as they said, the lost years heavyweights. His conditioning sometimes was a little bit left for much desire. And as was the case, he came in for 1 last payday with Frank Bruno over here in the UK. But capable fighter, but he was a hard puncher, naturally strong guy. And he had the nickname of the bionic hand, because he had some metal rods put in his hand when he had broken it or something. Whether that helped the punches, having metal rods in your hand, I don't know, but a bit of an interesting one. That'd be quite fun, actually, going through metal detectors at an airport. Yeah. But yes, no, good fighter. It's South Africa is not known for their heavyweights, and he's probably, along with who's the other chap? Rest in peace, Corey Sanders, who beat second chap to beat Vladimir Klitschko, beat him in the 2nd round. Him and Coetzee are probably the best 2 heavyweights that South Africa has to offer. But yes, in there with the mix with all of them, but wasn't dominant in any way. You had Larry Holmes, but that's all the way up to 1985, and then it was the case of the others, and it was just passing the title from one to the other. And I'm sure we're going to venture into Mr. Tim Witherspoon shortly.
Shortly, but before we do, we're going to talk about Pinklon Thomas.
Oh, okay. Pinky, trained by Angelo Dundee. Now, Pinklon Thomas, he had a very good fighter, one of the best jabs, certainly from the heavyweights in the 80s. Now, his problem was, as is common with many, as we discussed, was drugs. So inconsistent. Now, he won the title. He lost the title, if I remember right. That was to, don't tell me, Pinklon Thomas. That could have been Trevor. That could have been Trevor Berbick. When then Trevor Berbick went on to defend against Mike Tyson. But he made a comeback, and he made the comeback against that was Tyson. Because I think he regained it, and that's when, because you had Pinklon Thomas in the unification series that they had in the 80s. Tyson dispatched him in sixth round, I think it was. I do believe 6th or 7th, but it was midway. After a continual barrage of punches, it was real highlight, real stuff from Tyson. Lost that. He then went in against a comeback in Evander Holyfield. And I do apologise, actually. It was earlier than 90. I think that Holyfield made his comeback. It will come back to my head in a second. I just got into my head in a second. I just got to get everyone in order as such. It's probably, he might have turned, maybe you can double check this in a moment, he might have turned over to heavyweight in 89, but it's against James Quick Tillis. That's probably why they would have mentioned him. I think he just squeaked it in maybe in 89. But Pinklon Thomas come back after a period of time out and tried his luck against Evander Holyfield, coming back completely bald and looking not so healthy as he did in the past. Because, you know, for the fight with Mike Tyson, he did actually start well. He was trained at that point by Angelo Dundee. And Dundee had a lot of people, I was about to say fooled, but convinced, should I say, that he was going to upset Tyson. But no, he put it was a good test for Tyson, but he steamrolled him in the end, as per most other fighters in the 80s. But again, it is somebody that was ruined by drugs. And this is so typical with the 80s. Some of the 90s, and not so much recently. I can't think of anyone apart from the big chap that was done for it's all down. It's now PEDs anyway, not generally recreational drugs, which they're wasting their careers on. But it was very much recreational drugs, with the newfound fame and coke being the #1 party thing with their after-fight parties.
Apparently so.
Yes, absolutely. But yes, after he lost to Evander Holyfield, I do believe he had a couple of other fights, then sort of fizzled out. But he's got his health. He works now. If he's still doing it, I think he's a counsellor to young people. Obviously, going on about the hazards of drugs and stuff, and working with kids. Fair play to him. A good end to the career. But he remembered well that, you know, the tussle with Tyson was good. He did hold the title once. One of the list of the champions that again were not at all dominant in the 80s.
Well, then that brings us to number 4, Tim Witherspoon.
Okay. Hopefully Tim won't be watching this one. And now, curious case. Tim Witherspoon went in with Larry Holmes in 1982, I do believe. Now, he was fit, very light, and he gave a in peak, or slightly on the curve down. But he did well over the 15 rounds with Larry Holmes. Yep. Very well. And if I remember right, that Witherspoon was chasing the rematch, but it was never granted. Whether that was a duck, I can't remember, but it just never materialized. But Tim Witherspoon did pick up the title again. And with anyone from England listening to this, obviously that was the WB. Oh God, which version was it? The WBA? Would have been the WBA version. I think so. I think it's the WBA. I might stand corrected with that one. But one of the defenses against Mr. Frank Bruno, who was challenging for the first time for a heavyweight title, who lost in the 11th round. Caught on the chin, and Bruno back then, unfortunately, didn't know how to cling on to a fighter, hence his losses. And when he did finally learn to cling on to somebody, he did to Oliver McCall and outlasted him, clung on like an octopus, and managed to scrape the WBC title in 1990. God, what was that? 95, I think it was. But back to Tim. He was in shape with Holmes.
Yep.
He had some good wins, but then he seemed to fluctuate in weight. And you probably know his story better than mine, so I do stand to be corrected here. He lacked motivation, and some of it was down to being, how could I put it, in layman's terms, fully shafted by Don King.
Correct.
And the situation you had between the two of them. Now, Tim, he won the championship, defended against Bruno. I remember he was going into the, this was the or was it actually part of the heavyweight unification system, which Don King put together? But apparently Tim was really shafted over by this deal. He came in with Bone Crusher Smith, who Tim had already beaten. He came in as a last minute standby. Somebody, who was it that pulled out? I'll come back to the moment. His original foe pulled out. In came Bone Crusher Smith, who he had previously beaten on points. And Tim, in a not so good shape, Tim got blasted out in the first round. So that was the end of his title ambitions. Tim carried on, and you could say definitely too late in his career. He had some notable wins. It was very much from then on, win some, lose some. Surprised a few when he was not the favoured fighter to win. Notably, the second person to defeat Jorge Luis Gonzalez, the Cuban chap I was on about, who was unbeaten going into the Riddick Bowe fight. Right. He was the second person to put him in his place. And once Tim dispatched him in the 9th round, I think it was later on in the fight, I think Bowe put him in his place. I think it was round 5 or 6, and I think Tim followed up by a latter round KO. But that was the end of Jorge Gonzalez. But yes, after going back to him in the 80s, it was just a case of win some, lose some. Questionable motivation, questionable weight. He would come in, one weight for another fight, the next one it'd be way overweight, which is a shame because Tim, based on how he was against Larry Holmes, very light. I think it was something like 215 pounds around the Carter weight, probably 215, 217, if I remember right. Could have been 220, but it was light compared to the rest of his career. Right. Because even when he fought Frank Bruno after winning the title, he was actually overweight at that point. But if he would have continued with that desire and that motivation, weight, etc., after what he did to Holmes, bear in mind Holmes was in the start of decline at that point, I'm sure Tim would have picked up the title again, but sadly he didn't, and that was the end of that. But very good fighter, very good. I'm just not saying it because of the connection with you, but no, it was a waste of talent. So much promise there. He did win the title, but that wasn't even at his best. You look at the fight.
Yeah, he'll be the first to admit that a lot of the damage done in his career was courtesy of Don King. He talks about it often and quite honestly, and it's quite a shame. Anyway, yeah, Tim's a good guy, and his main motivation these days, FYI, is the creation of a union, in particular to maintain the health and safety, quite frankly, of boxers presently fighting and after they retire.
Now, the funny thing with Tim, though, with that picture I sent you with me and Tim, is such a big hand. I mean, I've either got a small head or he's got a very big hand, and I think it's actually he's got a big hand. He's got it next to my head. It's just like, what the hell?
Yeah.
He won't remember, but I was at an event and we were sat next to each other. So I must get used to this. The computer's there, you're there, but I'm got to talk to there. Actually, Mike's here. But no, we were at an event and I was sat next to him, and lovely chap. He was the day I met Van Holyfield. Yes, that was cool. Very good event. But nice guy. And again, not because of your connection, but good fighter. Shame about Don King, but he wasn't the only one that got majorly shafted by Mr. King. How the hell Don King is still alive, kicking, promoting, and still in boxing at this age in 2021, God knows. And he's still up to his usual tricks as well. I don't know if you know about the debacle that happened a short while ago when you had the Christopher Lovejoy that was going over to Germany to fight Manuel Charr, and there was all sorts of crap. Actually, no, there was problems before that when Christopher Lovejoy came over to the UK to fight Dave Allen, and King managed to block legally Lovejoy fighting. Wow. He's still, that's Mr. Court Case. perfectionist. He's got law and everything, and you know, back then, especially in the 80s, when he was, because when did he start? He started promoting. I think was it the first promotion or an early one of his was actually the wasn't Thriller in the Manila. It was the George Foreman bout that was done by King. It was one of his first ones. But he's had a strong hold of it all the way through the 80s. It was all Don King. You know, he snatched Tyson away from Tyson's original team, sacking, my God, even the trainer, Kevin Rooney, in the ring, following the Spinks loss in the ring. That is just cold. But yes, he's still kicking very much in his 90s, I think Don King is.
Must be.
Yes, Mr. Don King, because he was done for murder, wasn't it, or something? He's been tried. That was back in, was it the 60s? I think it was, late 60s. A good documentary, by the way, if anyone wants to know anything about Don King, just go to YouTube, put Don King, murder, you know, whatever, it'll come up. And yes, maybe he's a completely reformed character, but yeah, he was a bit of a not so nice guy back in the day. Now, just with the comments here, I've just had somebody say about how to Usyk match with Holyfield. Okay, I'm pro Holyfield, but that aside, it would have been very good. Usyk, as a cruiserweight, he's, you know, probably first, second, and you can argue between Holyfield and Usyk, who is the best. You know, both unified, both have done well. You could argue maybe Holyfield could have the slight edge. As a fighter, because the question was, okay, so it didn't stipulate cruiserweight or heavyweight. So you hope now Holyfield went there and proved his worth. You've got everything to work with. But unfortunately, with Usyk, you haven't got much to work with still, because if you had the fight with Chaz Witherspoon, didn't show much at all. You had the Chisora fight where it showed weakness with Usyk more than anything, even if he was properly handled. I mean, Chisora actually did quite well in that fight. But then obviously the masterclass with AJ. I think whether this will be Usyk's last fight, whether we carry on for the next 5 years, or regardless what happens, I think we'd be able to probably put, I think, Usyk into proper perspective with AJ in the rematch. Because if he's dominant again, which he was in the first fight, then absolutely shoots even further up, just in my opinion. But, you know, if, for example, because AJ, I think, is about the only one that can improve in the rematch, unless Usyk has got more up his sleeve, where he said, you haven't seen, you know, everything of me yet. I do believe that, because how good he is. But, you know, as long as what I'm trying to get at here is that it's happened so many times in history with fighters that they come in, they're overlooked because of they're the underdog. AJ was supposed to win that fight. Usyk was better than people imagined, so he shot the champion. Now, so many times in the return, the fighter that got beaten, who was the actual the one who was favoured to win, comes back and does better. So it's just a shock win instead of a consistent win, if that makes sense. If Usyk repeats and does the job again on AJ, Usyk would be right up there. Obviously, that's only going to be 1, 2, 3, a fourth fight at heavyweight. Holyfield went on for years, and the rest is history with that. The thing with Holyfield is, in 1993, he was regarded as washed up. Actually, 92, because after the first Bow fight, and he went in with Manuel Stewart at that point, with the first fight with the rematch with Alex Stewart, and he laboured in that fight in the rematch with Alex Stewart. At that point, that was 1993, he was completely regarded as washed up, yet went on to win the title a further 2 times, went on to all the way through to 2011. Last fight with Franz Botha. Funny ending to that fight. Wow. But that was how many years after being regarded as washed up? Yeah. Sadly in decline, should retire now. Same kind of calls you had with Wilder recently. So is Wilder going to shock us and come back and win it again and be dominant for another 10 years or something? I think not, but I'm still not surprised with anything, because I'm going way off track here. I did warn you, 4.5 hours sleep. It's going to happen. But yeah, Wilder could come back and, you know, he could beat, I think as Carl said the other week, he'd probably beat the rest of them. Absolutely. If the 2 draining fights haven't affected him physiologically in a bad way, or maybe his psyche could be, you know, it's, I don't think somebody like that would land up being gun shy or something, but those 2 draining fights, the knockout and the draining beatdown before, can be enough to finish anybody. The only thing that I think is going for Wilder is that up to prior to those two heavy fights with Fury, you had just one tough fight, which was with the first one with Ortiz, and that was it. So I think he'd probably come back and be okay. I don't think it'd be dominant for another 10 years or something, but we shall see. Crystal ball away. Where were we before I went off completely off a tangent? Somebody brought up Holyfield, Usyk. It's a close one. I think it's just as fighters, would be cruiserweight, mixing a bit of heavyweight as well. I think maybe Holyfield slight edge, but regardless of who, I think Holyfield won. I think Usyk number 2, absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. Definitely cruiserweight. As fighters, mixing in heavyweight, yet to be seen. Let's see what other tricks that Marvel, that is Usyk, can pull. Anyway, back to the 80s and heavyweights. Next up is
Mike Weaver.
Hercules, as he was called.
Yes.
Because he had a fabulous physique. Now, he was one of the, I was about to say dominant, but he wasn't. But he was one of the emerging champions. He was former champion. He came up in the late 70s.
Right.
Now, who did he win the title against? I think that was possibly Jerry Coetzee. It was such a
John Tate.
Big John Tate. God, that was, rest in peace, John Tate. The story about John Tate, he could have been one of the best, certainly in the 80s, but that was somebody else that partied women. I'm not going to use that term dick about again, but so common with all the heavyweights in the 80s. Now, as much as it is the lost period or the lost whatever, how it was deemed at that time, I still say that came from in the 90s when they were looking back at the 80s. With the state of the heavyweight division now, bearing in mind there's good fights there, but because it's all so much heavier, I do think, with the exception of Fury, how he was in version 1 up to Klitschko, a lot of technique has gone out the window. It's just not the same as the 90s. Okay, that was yesterday's story. Back to Weaver. He had such a great physique, very hard puncher, but he was chinny. He had suspect whiskers, whatever you want to call it, glass jaw. He was in some very good fights, but it was another one that won it, lost it. I think, did he win it again? But no, hard puncher. Weaver is still alive. He went on for a long time, actually. I've got to remember he faced Lennox Lewis, an outdoor fight. God, when was that? That was when Lewis was on the way up. He went on for too long, but there's nothing I've seen in reports where bad health or anything. In fact, I've not heard anything about Weaver for a long time. But it was just a sad decline. He sort of lurked around at fringe world level for quite a while, then sort of disappeared into the sunset. I think one of his last fights is a real funny one. It was with Bone Crusher Smith, where both of them, I think, were grossly overweight. Where Bone Crusher Smith went on for too long. Seemed a bit of a trend back then, way too long. Weird fights, but no, hung around too long. He was just in that mix of the titles just being passed from one to the other. It was just a pattern that was just happening. It's just that they'd win it, and they might have made one defense and then lost it the next one, but it's pretty much win it, lose it on the next one. It was just passed around. It's just a merry-go-round with the title. Nobody was dominant, and they would just, party it and screw it away.
Yep. Speaking of dominant, number 2, Mike Tyson.
God, in the 80s, who's going to be number 1? Oh, it's going to be Larry Holmes, of course.
Yep.
Mike Tyson, my God, number 2. How? Okay, Tyson skipped the Olympics, went professional. To me, at heavyweight in the 80s, absolutely best of all time, I still say, but I will tag at the end of Tyson, as I did yesterday or the other day. His peak was short. Now, his peak was arguably 85 to 88. Right. Obviously, 85 just before winning the title, because he won it against Trevor Berbick. I think it's November the 22nd, 1986. And up until the bout with Spinks, we dispatched him in 81 seconds. That was the peak. And as I said to you the other day, the problem with Mike Tyson, the reason why a lot of people put him down, is because of they look further in the career where he's still in his 20s, but it's even the version 2 after the Buster Douglas loss, right, or version 3 after being away from the game for 3.5 years, after raping Desiree Washington. Now, he was still late 20s when he came back. You know, that's still early now. So people look at those fights and, oh, he was the bully. He would, you know, come out, and if he could knock you out, he would fade in the second half. Well, that was in the 2000s with people like Kevin McBride at the end of the career, with Danny Williams, with Lennox Lewis. These were all, he was competitive in the first half, and then second half he would fall apart. You know, they're based him at the end of his career or in the middle of his career, or he was even in sharp decline at the age of 23, because he won it, because he when he won the title in 86 against Trevor Berbick, he was the youngest heavyweight champion at that point at age 20. Now, he was in decline at 23, and people base how good he is from 24 and upwards, which is unfair. You've got to gauge a fighter with their peak. And Tyson was short, but that Tyson, who was ticked every single box, and I'll argue to toss with this with anybody, because Tyson was the complete fighter. Apart from not being tall, 5'10". It's funny how at the time they were saying 5'11", 5'11", and as time passes, oh yeah, it's really 5'10", which everyone was pretty much saying back then, but it wasn't reported that way. You know, Tyson ticked every box: speed, power, movement, boxing abilities, chin, everything, aggression. Break it down into fine detail. He had it all. So how could he be not the best? He had everything, and he was devastating. The only thing that could be thrown at him could be, okay, some of the fighters on the way up were a bit suspect and not the best of the crop, but that is the route of every champion. Show me any champion's rise where it hasn't been the usual A to Z of the journeyman, then gatekeepers, etc., as they move, you know, from turning pro up to championship, if they get that far level. It's the case with all of them. You know, if people want to put resumes down, God, any heavyweight now, tell me, you know, Anthony Joshua, what his best win is. Fury, what's his best win? Okay, Klitschko, but that was at age 40. 2 wins over Wilder. But how good is Wilder? Because Wilder, look at his resume. What's the best win on Wilder's resume? There isn't anything. They're all like ex-football players, or there's school teachers, or whatever. Right. Nothing. And this is the thing, and I just think it's so unfair with just the Mike Tyson bashing, because as much as he was my favorite fighter, I sadly have to say that he is the best. And apart from Fury and the version that beat Klitschko that could bob, weave, box, long reach, tall, all the rest of it, he's the only one that would stand a chance. Tyson, in that 3-year peak, would have rolled over everybody. Should be number 1, but number 2, fair enough. A lot of people would base it not as low as that, based on this thing where that, oh yeah, see, look, the fights, he was 25 and it wasn't so good. Sharp decline. You know, was that the version 2 or even version 3? Still in his 20s, at the, you know, okay, late 20s. But that was, you know, that was considerably, you know, he was running probably about 60%, 50% of what he was. He ticked every box, quite simply. Number 2, okay, could be worse, and it's just an opinion, so be it. But speak to all these people that lost to him, and very quickly, and who they say the best is.
Right.
Absolutely. Well, so that leaves number 1. It can only be.
And it can only be Larry Holmes.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Good man.
What a list of victims.
He was great. He would stand up well. And this is now I'm going to go compare him to the fighters of today.
Yes.
Just a little bit on Larry Holmes. He won the title, God, was it 78? But he was unbeaten going in with Ken Norton. This is when Muhammad Ali was stripped of the title. And it was Ken Norton. He was stripped. Ken Norton was upgraded to champion, and the first defense being against Larry Holmes. Okay. Great win, split decision win for Holmes in an absolute barn burner, one of the best top 10 heavyweight fights ever. Holmes was dominant from that point all the way through to the 1985 Spinks loss, compiling at that point a record of 47-0, not managing to equal Rocky Marciano's 48-0, and beaten every challenge. Some of them, yes, were close, and he was dropped in a few of them. He was the second to last person to beat Muhammad Ali in 1980. Sad fight that was, when Ali just came in too light. Then he had just had the one fight after that with Trevor Berbick. But Holmes was good. The only thing that would bring into now the modern day heavyweights with him is that he was very light. Now, obviously, he went through it in his 30s and he went up in weight as the career went on. But at his peak, he was only weighing 215 and he was 6'2.5", 3. I don't know if you can, around that kind of height, sort of mid height, but light. That kind of fighter, purely based on weight, bearing in mind that is a bridger weight, would struggle with somebody of, just in my opinion, of a lesser caliber, let's say, for example, but they've got that weight advantage. You know, it's as a fighter bringing a fighter from the 80s, and this applies to most of them, because if you look down the weights of any of the fighters in the in the heavyweight division, if there was any weight on them, it wasn't healthy weights, just because they got fat, because a lot of them did with all the partying once they won the title, etc. But Holmes was dominant. He was also always motivated, always fit. The only person he overlooked was Michael Spinks when he suffered his first loss, with Michael Spinks obviously moving up from light heavyweight, bypassing the newly formed cruiserweight. Yes, it just been formed, and he bypassed cruiserweight straight up to heavyweight. But Holmes was great. He was very good, but weight would have caused a problem. 215, stick him in with a good 245-pound heavyweight that can move, that's reasonably good. It's too much of a weight deficit first off before anything else comes into it. Okay, more so with Cassius Clay, more so with Joe Louis, we'll go further back in time when a heavyweight way back then was actually probably a light heavyweight. Right. Crazy, but that's why it should be a super heavyweight and not stick things in between cruiserweight and heavyweight. Oh God, that's another story. But no, he was good. He had one of the best jabs in history, and this is why he overlooked Spinks, because he said my jab would be like a light heavyweight's right cross. And as it turned out, that was the case, but the light heavyweight was very quick and very motivated, with Spinks winning and beating him. Now, the majority, I think, then give me your opinion, because I'm bubbling on again. It's now 53, deja vu. I think that, a lot of the fighters were unmotivated, and due to the party and the reasons that we said, putting those guys in with the guys of now, I don't think skill-wise, there's not too much difference, I think, with them and now. I think skill-wise, or natural skill, whichever way you would look at it, I think the 80s heavyweights have got a slight edge over the chaps now. What you've got now is that I just think they're stronger, bigger, with all the training techniques and everything that's taken place over time. But the skill, I think, was that little bit more. But the weights of the chaps now were I think it's just a deciding factor, because it's such a deficit to overcome before skill comes into it, before anything else comes into it. It'd be reach. They're now, Larry Holmes was regarded as a big heavyweight, and he was 6'3", 2.5, 6'3", around that mark. They're now, as we well know, 6'6", 6'7", 6'9", or 7'2" if you include Valuev. Easily forgotten. Skill-wise, they were better, but they would have struggled, majority of them, with the fighters now. Who would have won? Flip a coin, because it's like some of the fighters now are coming in a little bit overweight, unmotivated. I mean, Dylan White, especially, he's had some good wins on his career. His weight has fluctuated up and down. And as much as he's 19 stone, and none of them back then were 19 stone, right, he still reminds me of a bit of a throwback 80s fighter. I kind of rate White. He's good. But I'm not so sure about this pull-out with Otto Wallin. That's a different story. But White reminds me very much of an 80s heavyweight. The weight would fluctuate. His motivation would fluctuate. But a good fighter, but not the best. Can he win a world title? Don't know, maybe. It would depend what's going to, what else is going to happen in the merry-go-round that's going up at the top currently. Yes, with all that's going on. But if he is going to go with Fury, maybe he can. But I don't think he will come anywhere close to Fury, unfortunately. He's a big man who would beat most of the heavyweights out there. But, to me, he's like a throwback, heavier 80s fighter. But I think the 80s fighters would struggle. The average 80s fighter would struggle with size now, because size is a big factor if speed isn't affected. What do you think?
Two things. One, I absolutely concur. The distractions of the 80s had their impact on their careers, or respective careers. And the other, is 15 rounds. These guys were contending in a different world of boxing, quite frankly, than today's fighters. So these fighters today are training, not, shall we say, as long distance runners, if you to draw that equation, but they would be making their impact on a shorter amount of time, quite frankly. So I'll give that to the 80s fighters, the endurance, if you will, the having to slug it out for 15 rounds.
Yeah, a few of the fighters now would struggle.
Right.
Yeah, they struggle sort of going 11th, 10th, the 10th or the 11th, 12th. So 15, yes.
Yeah. And so I think today's fighters, in terms of the management class, if you will, is better at steering their fighters away from these distractions. Maybe not so much in Tyson Fury's camp, because he readily admits his distractions are quite...
And still does well.
And still does well. So
but he cannot go up in weight and come down weight forever. That cannot.
Right.
His body, it'd be the Ricky Hatton situation. It will give one day, but he's doing it right. He's winning. Who am I to say?
Right. So that's briefly my opinion of the 80s from what I remember of the 80s. And no, you did an amazing job of giving us a story on each one of those fighters. The writer of that article, by the way, had a proviso saying, "Hey, man, if you had Tyson at number one in the 80s, you wouldn't be wrong." He said, because Holmes and Tyson were legendary, and they were the two most dominant fighters of the 80s. So really a toss of the coin in terms of one or two. But yeah, so there you go.
And that is it. You have to dash.
I have to dash.
I did all right in my 4.5 hours sleep, but
well done.
Little energy drink, 30p, does a good job.
Well done for you.
So until Monday, when I'll see you next, have a good weekend.
Absolutely. And have fun in Blackpool, Carl. As a young child, we would go see the Blackpool Illuminations, because Preston is not too far from where you're at right now. Is there any fighting going on in Blackpool? Do they have fighting in Blackpool? I know they have a beach.
They do, but not that I've seen on the roster. But there's very small shows going around that go under the radar, unfortunately. Right. And it's little ones. Sometimes I'm trying to, in each country, I'm trying to cover to get them bolstered. I like to cover the big ones, but the small ones as well. What everyone else isn't doing. And that does well actually with the visits. I do so well with the small hall shows. The sweaty ones in Mexico somewhere, and
sure.
The sweaty small hall things. But no, it's good.
Absolutely.
Okay, have a good weekend.
Thanks very much. Cheers.
And take care.
We'll see you Monday.